Well, look at that. Check that out. It's been a while, but here it is. It's Ace Combat 7. Look at that. Look at all those graphics and wow. You know, look at all the wow. We're just getting into that action. You know, it's clear that look at the technology. It's come so far. Ooh, hey, look, there's those clouds they worked hard on. Those are pretty interesting. I don't know, man. This looks kind of, I don't know. I don't have a great feeling about this. I think this game, I think it's a little disappointing. You know, it doesn't look very good, and it's, I don't know what's up with that story. It's kind of weird. Yeah, I'm gonna give this game, you know, 2 inarguably, you know, absolute video game points out of 10. And that's it. I think it was really just kind of disappointing. Okay, well, if you're still here, then you've probably guessed by the title of the video and the fact that, you know, this is not Ace Combat 7 in the footage, that this is not Ace Combat 7. We're gonna get there. We will, eventually. But I kind of want to do an interesting thing with this series. I don't want to just make a CinemaSins garbage video picking apart some stupid nitpick like, you know, the translator forgot to capitalize a word or something. I want to actually get into a series which I do passionately very enjoy. And I want to get through into them basically game by game and use each game as a little kind of, you know, focus to look at some aspect of this series that I think is just kind of interesting to me. And then by the time we get to Ace Combat 7, we'll actually have a pretty good kind of dialogue in terms of things we can talk about and I can talk back to as a comparison for why I do think Ace Combat 7 did disappoint me. But it's all in perspective at that point. It's not like I have to, you know, go over all this all over again, and basically you know what I'm talking about. And also, it'll let me talk about these games I like. So with that out of the way, this is Air Combat. It was on the PS1. Actually pretty fun. It's pretty good. It's based on an arcade game that got ported to the PS1, but, I mean, it doesn't matter. You know, that stuff was so old that, like, the limitations basically forced them to focus on gameplay anyway. So that's what this episode's about. It's about gameplay. Now, talking about gameplay in a video game means I should probably bring up the game flow and the game loop. Now, these things sound kind of complicated, but they really aren't. The game flow is basically what a person does when they engage with a game in terms of gameplay. And in the very abstract, you can say they start a game, do what the game demands of them, and then win. It's kind of, you know, very vague, and that's because you really have to focus it down on a game-by-game basis to really get into it. Ace Combat, they give you a mission, they really specifically outline what you need to do, you do it, and you win the mission. That's essentially what the core flow of the game is. You're moving through that kind of pattern. Now, that's not really what I find super interesting to talk about or to think about. What I find interesting to talk about is the actual gameplay loop. Now, the thing that's interesting about this series is that even though a long amount of time has passed by, the core loop of these games actually hasn't changed. In essence, Ace Combat is a game where you take the challenge of moving a jet through a virtual space, put yourself in the position to take out those targets, and then, with some added detail depending on the mission, achieve the mission and win. And even Ace Combat 7, which came out this year, and Air Combat here, which came out quite a long time ago, that core loop is essentially intact. You know, the controls have changed, the graphics have changed, the setting has changed, and, you know, things have gotten quite visually complicated. But in terms of gameplay, that is the same thing. So, that core loop is something that actually doesn't happen all at once. That's not too surprising. You can actually see just by the mission screen of an Ace Combat or by the, you know, summary screen afterwards that it's really a series of those loops chained together. A good Ace Combat mission is completed in the way where the player efficiently moves from groups of enemies, puts themselves in a position to take out those enemies, moves to the next group, and then does so until the mission objective is complete. And that's something that the games themselves point out quite a lot. Every Ace Combat game has mission screens and summary screens to really drive home the fact that you should be as efficiently moving between targets as possible. So that's the basic outline. Now the loop then gets a little more interesting when we can look at the difference, say, between ground targets and air targets. Now, in essence, the same thing needs to happen. You as the player need to put yourself in a position where you can take out those targets in an advantageous manner. Air targets have the three-dimensional movement of flight, which can pose a challenge to you and a difficulty. There, the difficulty is matching your speed and position and angle in such a way where you can get behind them and attack them. Now, for this episode, I think it's fine to just say that you should get behind a thing, shoot the missiles at the thing until it dies, and that's pretty much the gist of air targets. Better air targets will be better at moving in the air. Worst air targets will be more vulnerable and slower. The other half of that is ground targets. Ground targets, on the other hand, their movement is restricted, to the plane that they are on, and also they're slow. They're never going to be as fast as air targets. Until Ace Combat has a mission where you attack a bullet train, that's just going to be the fact of the matter. So with ground targets, the challenge then comes from their positioning. The terrain essentially becomes the challenge with ground targets. If it's a city mission, you've got to fly between specific buildings. If it's a canyon mission, you got to go through, the route of the canyon. You can't maybe go above or whatever. So the terrain is really what adds the difficulty to this basic concept of put yourself in a place where you can attack the enemy and destroy them. And that's about it. Now, it's interesting, there's a lot of variation in those details, but I don't want to bring it up right now. Just keep that vague kind of picture in mind, and we can kind of compare the details on a case-by-case basis going from game to game. All you need to know about here in air combat is that the planes are generally a bit slower, and it might be due to hardware, it might be due just to making it a little more accessible for people, as this was an arcade game, and you really can't expect, a quarter reader to really have the same kind of staying power for people, as a game you can play at home and really hone and get good at. And so the challenge does have to be more manageable in an arcade game, or at least has to have some kind of, manageable gradient where they can sucker you in before they really throw you under the bus and can suck your money out. Anyway, so that's that. Now, the other thing I do want to mention in terms of gameplay that does make Ace Combat, one of the more standouties in terms of being in a weird position, is that it does fill a strange spot between arcade and sim. There's a lot of debate between a lot of Ace Combat fans. Is it a sim? Is it an arcade game? From the outside, who knows? What does that even mean? So I'm going to specify, sims are things where they want it to be like real life, in essence. It's a simulator. A plane simulator will have you going through the cup holder adjustment, statistics. Even though it would be banal and boring for most people, the thrill for simulator players is really in getting that deep kind of, immersion, as if you're actually doing the thing. Arcadey things, on the other hand, are more so focused on giving you the fun of the thing. They're more so focused on giving you the enjoyment. If you were to play a submarine game that was a sim, then you'd have to be doing things like, managing air supply. And that's actually a bit too exciting. Managing food supply. Let's start with that. If you play for 20 hours, then you can get to, air supply. Maybe you can fire one torpedo in a very, very specific situation, after a couple hours of play, and you know what you're doing. Arcade submarine game, on the other hand, you're going to be running all over the place, shooting torpedoes, and so this comes back to air combat here, and Ace Combat, and the bigger question of, well, is it a sim, is it an arcade game? I'd say it's an arcade game. It wants to give you the thrill, it wants to give you the impression of the joy of doing the thing, and the sim elements really only peak in every once in a while as a slight difficulty factor. So when you slow down too much, you'll stall. Is that because, air combat is a real sim? No, it's because that's the challenge of the game. It's supposed to keep you, immersed in the thrill of moving quickly through the air, attacking air targets and ground targets without slowing down. Slowing down makes things easier to hit, so there's, a penalty for that movement. They want to keep you fast. The challenge of moving fast. The challenge of moving fast, through tight spaces as the missions go on and the difficulty increases. And the challenge of, moving fast and really hitting targets, as quickly as possible when they also start to move faster as well. Everything's in motion. And so with that, I do want to get to something that I like to call the fear drive axis. Now this is something I've developed kind of dealing with real life, but I apply it to Ace Combat because it really is relevant. The fear drive axis is, in the simplest of terms, how people deal with machines. Machines are scary, they can be weird, but machines can also be really fun and kind of insane. And so, at one end of the fear drive axis you have, don't touch the belt sander, it's dangerous, it's going to tear your hands off, it's dangerous, don't do it. At the other hand, you have basically the drive end, that's SpongeBob on the accelerator. You're really gunning it, you're really pushing the machine. You have no fear in terms of dealing with whatever mechanism you have. Now, why is this relevant to Ace Combat, you might ask? Well, because in essence, this is actually a really good example of trying to balance those two things. You're always trying to drive and get faster and faster in the missions, efficiently take down targets, move quickly, move efficiently, don't waste missiles, don't waste movement. But at the same time, it's a jet game. You have to be able to have the spatial awareness and also ability to manage this changing reference frame of being in an aircraft, to not be intimidated by the fact that you can't slow down, you can't stop and, look around at your surroundings. You're not Master Chief, you can't, take a break and just, hide behind some boxes or whatnot. You have to be constantly moving. And so, in the middle of that fear drive axis is basically a thing that I like to call the zone. Now, what the zone is when you've basically gotten to the point where you know how to use the machine enough that you don't fear it, but you also know that the machine has its own limitations, and you don't want to go crazy with it. You get to the zone. When you're in the zone, it doesn't matter what you're using. You could be using a spork, you could be using a forklift, you could be using, anything. It doesn't matter. Any tool has a zone where you are fully maximizing your ability to control and master it. And in Air Combat, in the Ace Combat series, that essentially means mastering jets and moving and how to use them and just all that kind of detail of how to deal with aircraft. Now, it's obviously still an arcade game, so it's still all abstracted. It's not like you're really, certified to fly or do, emergency landings anytime soon. But this is essentially the core of it. So, in conclusion, I want to kind of bring those two things together and describe what I think is the core gameplay of Ace Combat. Ace Combat is essentially a game where you need to get good enough at moving around in a thing non-stop while keeping track of where you need to be and how to get there, and then getting to those spots, and then figuring out how to put yourself in the position where you can take down enemies, and if they're in the air, it means putting yourself and matching their maneuverability. If it's on the ground, it means matching basically their terrain to a point where you have a clean angle of attack. There's other details, there's lots of details and stuff I'm not really covering too much, because I just want to make this episode just the basics and the foundation really. And so, in essence, I think that's pretty much a good description and a good place to stop for now. And next week we're going to get into Ace Combat 2, which is arguably, I think, the real kind of start of the series.